You've probably been seeing a lot of headlines about the United States debt ceiling being reached and how the US government is in jeopardy of not being able to pay its debts, and how that could lead to a giant shock to the global economy, possibly causing a deep, deep recession, millions of jobs lost, cats and dogs forced to live together, and more. Let's bring you up to speed on what you need to know, including how we got here in the first place, or should I say, the 94th place.
The limit does not exist.
The debt ceiling has been raised or suspended 93 times since 1940, and what's now become predestined political theater. But it's not harmless theater. There are consequences. Hey everyone, my name is Preet and I'm a consultant to the wealth management industry, and this channel is for anyone who wants to learn more about the world of money around us. Okay, let's start with a quick breakdown of what's happened now, and then we'll go over some terminology and background so you really understand what's going on, because this is going to happen again. Over the weekend of May 28th, President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy announced that they had finally come to a potential deal that would allow for the government to avoid defaulting on its debt. So right off the bat, let's start with some definitions. There's a difference between a deficit and a debt. A deficit is when the government spends more than it takes in a given year. So for example, if they collect $6 trillion in tax revenue but spend $7 trillion in all the things that government does, then they would be running a $1 trillion annual deficit. So they have to borrow money to fund that deficit, and this borrowed money is the debt. They borrow money by issuing things like treasury bills and government bonds and so on. And if they keep on running annual deficits, they keep on racking up the debt, which currently stands at $31.5 trillion, give or take. So that part is pretty easy to explain, but what does it mean to default on debt? Again, it's actually pretty simple. Defaulting on debt basically means that the US will have failed to make an interest or principal payment on the debt that they owe. And every day they've got payments to make on their debt for the various debt issues that they've put out. And missing a payment would be bad. And no one actually knows how badly the markets would react to such an unthinkable event, but I will lay out the projected worst case scenario later in this video. It is generally accepted that the safest investment on earth is US Treasury bills, often just called T-bills. But why? Well, because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. And that means something. So what is the political standoff that threatened the ability of the United States to make payments on its debt? In order to understand this, we need to go back in time, way back in time. We have to go all the way back to the First World War. The United States had to figure out how to pay for its war efforts, for entering the war. And to give you some context, the annual expenditures of the United States federal government before the First World War were just under $1 billion. The estimated cost of the U.S. entering the First World War and its total war efforts was going to be $30 billion. So that's a pretty tall order. Where are you going to get all that money from? Well, the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve together were tasked with coming up with the business plan for financing the war. And the man in charge of this, his name was William Gibbs McAdoo. And he had three main options that he could consider. He could increase taxes, he could borrow money, or he could print the money. Now, because money printing during the Civil War had helped contribute to super high rates of inflation, particularly on the Confederate side, where inflation started at about 700% during the first 2 years of the war and then climbed to more than 9,000%, money printing was not a super popular option. So McAdoo chose not to use that tool. He decided on a mix of increased taxes, which covered about 1/3 of the costs of the war, and to borrow for the remaining 2/3. Now, the government borrowed money by issuing bonds, but they put some marketing spin on it to drive up the purchases of these bonds by the people. They were marketed as war bonds, and officially known as Liberty bonds, just like the one Steve Rogers was promoting in the first Captain America movie.
Series E defense bonds. Each one you buy is a bullet in the barrel of your best guy's gun.
Now, the Second Liberty Bond Act in 1917 included a provision by which the Treasury could issue bonds up to a certain amount, known as the debt limit, for different categories of bond issues. So prior to that, Congress had to vote on the issuance of essentially every type of debt for each specific individual purpose. And later on in 1939, this was again tweaked, and it was changed from a series of debt category limits to one overall debt limit. But this new debt limit, which is an interchangeable term for the debt ceiling, it's the same thing, basically said, hey, listen, you go out and you issue all the debt you need to fund the promises that we pass in Congress without having to have a separate vote to fund those promises every single time. But there's going to be a hard overall limit just as a check and balance to make sure, that things don't get out of hand. Now, since 1940, that overall debt limit has been increased or suspended 93 times, which means it basically gets tweaked on average more than once a year. Now, this is very important. The debt ceiling is not the same thing as the total debt owed by the government, although sometimes they can kind of coincide. It's just the statutory limit that they could borrow up to. And when they do get near the limit is when they come up against the debt ceiling, and that's where problems arise because they are not allowed to increase the debt past this point without a vote to do so. So to a lot of people, this process is a bit nonsensical. In effect, what happens is that when a federal budget is proposed, which includes new programs and costs associated with these programs, when Congress votes on the budget, they consider the costs and ramifications to the nation's finances, and this includes knowing what impact these measures are projected to have on the total amount of debt that the country has and will have in the future. So when they pass a budget, they know fairly well if and when they're going to go past the debt ceiling. But then they just wait for that to happen, and then they have to vote again on whether they should fund the expenses they already approved before, which again doesn't make a lot of sense to many people. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say that you decide to go on a nice vacation. It'll cost you $10,000. You go, you put it on your credit card, and then you get back. You don't then decide if you want to pay for it, because if you later decide not to, you've got problems. In that case, if you didn't pay it, it's clear what would happen. Your credit rating would go in the tank. Your credit card company starts harassing you, and you're seen as more risky by lenders. And if you try to get new loans, they jack up the interest rates and so on. So it's not very pretty. And that is exactly why the debt ceiling has been raised 93 times since 1940. It used to be just more of a formality because who in their right mind would vote in laws, measures, or tax cuts, but then turn right around and vote not to fund those promises that they made? That would be crazy. And for many years, this was the routine. Congress would pass budgets and then in short order vote to adjust the debt ceiling so those promises could be funded if the government needed to borrow money, which it often does. Until 1953, which was the first time someone decided to use this odd procedural protocol to push a political agenda. At the time, the United States government spending was high and exacerbated by the costs of the Korean War. And the president at the time, Eisenhower, a Republican, asked for an increase in the debt ceiling, and it was easily passed by the House of Representatives as normal. But then in the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate decided to block it as they felt that spending was getting out of control. They compromised by agreeing to some cuts and increasing the debt ceiling by less than half of the original request. And I believe that this was the first time that this once procedural process had become weaponized as a political tool. Now, there have been other debt ceiling standoffs since then. This is just the latest version in 2023, and it probably won't be the last. But let's come back to the present now that you know the background. The deal that was struck between Biden and McCarthy, which is officially known as the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, and apparently is said with a straight face, passed in the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the president directly for signing into law. So the crisis is over in terms of the threat of the U.S. not being able to pay its debts. Essentially, the deal is to suspend the debt ceiling in exchange for some concessions negotiated on spending and some other issues. At a very high level, the Republicans wanted to see big cuts in exchange for agreeing to avoid a default, and the Democrats wanted to minimize those concessions and avoid a default. Now, I don't mean to minimize the details because they do have real-world implications and are serious, but this video is about the debt ceiling and why it's a thing. So, the grandstanding and brinksmanship that we see is all predicated on the fact that no one would actually let the U.S. government default on its debt, right? Because that would be so bad. And that emboldens both sides, waiting to see who blinks first. But turning this once procedural formality into a political weapon has consequences. Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen issued a statement right after the vote passed in the Senate in which she said, "I continue to strongly believe that the full faith and credit of the United States must never be used as a bargaining chip." So, what would happen if the U.S. defaulted on its debt? Again, no one really knows for sure, but the Council of Economic Advisors to the White House put out some hypothetical projections based on 3 different scenarios. Scenario number 1 is, just the political brinksmanship that we've been seeing. Scenario number 2 is a short default, and scenario number 3 is a protracted default. Now, just to be clear, we don't even know if a protracted default would be allowed to happen, because as much as everyone agrees that even a single missed payment should be avoided at all costs, a protracted default in which payments are missed for a long time is close to absolutely unthinkable. That being said, that worst case scenario carried with it a projected 45% drop in the stock market, over 8 million US jobs lost, not to mention global jobs, the economy contracting by over 6%. Cats and dogs would absolutely be living together. Highly implausible scenario, but that shows you just why you would want to avoid even a short default. You'd still have job losses, a stalled economy, and so on. Now, we can also take a look at this letter from the former Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, who sent this letter to Congress during a previous debt ceiling standoff in which he listed out the ramifications of missing a debt payment. And these include damage to the economy similar to the Great Recession of 2008-2009, effectively a substantial tax on all Americans as the cost of borrowing money for everyone would go up, corporations, governments, and individuals. The United States' reputation as a place to invest and its standing in the world order would be called into question. Disruption in paying salaries to the military, retirement benefits, getting tax refunds, and basically the functioning of a lot of things that people might take for granted. In other words, it would be bad. But just the brinksmanship has had an impact already. The last debt ceiling standoff led to Standard & Poor's, a credit rating agency, actually downgrading the U.S.'s debt rating from AAA to AA+, and it's been at that level ever since. A government's credit rating is like an individual's credit score in a sense. It's a signal as to how creditworthy one is. And so by using the debt ceiling as a political weapon, even by not ever having defaulted, the perception is that the full faith and credit of the United States is not as strong as once thought. And that's a hell of a thing. But for now, crisis averted today. They didn't default this time, so hopefully we can all take a beat. But don't you worry, we'll probably be here again in the next few years. If you've made it this far, I hope you'll hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this, and I will see you in the next video.